And I think every law student needs to ask themselves, what will the legal industry look like in 30 years? And is the big firm structure the kind of structure that will be in place 30 years from now?
You might have heard the expression, there are two sure things in life, death and taxes. But tax law is about a lot more than that. This podcast from the University of Ottawa Tax Law Society has two goals: to help students find careers in tax and to ask questions about the hidden side of tax, from cryptocurrencies and AI to the Pandora Papers, from funding universal minimum incomes to even what tax has to do with your favorite streaming service. As a former journalist and a first-year law student, I don't know much about tax law yet, but I do like when cities are clean and people are healthy, which are two places where tax money goes. This show is for beginners like me and experts like my guests who'll have some answers. Because if there are only two sure things in life, let's at least make sure the tax part is interesting. Alex Klyguine is the owner of Taxpayer Law, a firm that launched in June 2021 and that specializes in corporate and personal tax law. He got his JD and MBA from York University in 2013 and worked at Borden Ladner Gervais after summering and articling at the Bay Street firm during law school. After 3 years, he went to Osler, Hoskin and Harcourt, where he spent another 3 years working in tax before launching his own firm. He's worked on billion-dollar deals and published tax articles, and when he's not too busy doing all that, he's volunteered with the United Way and the Daily Bread Food Bank. So when you graduated from your JD MBA from Osgoode, you went straight into practicing tax law. What was your interest from the start?
I didn't necessarily have a huge interest in tax law right out of law school. I have taken several tax courses, but I didn't have a huge interest. It was one of the courses I really liked. But I actually really, really like tort law, and I still keep in touch with my tort law professor. So I went into the big firm thinking, you know what, let me try tort law. And BLG at the time still is a pretty heavy in tort law in terms of its practice areas. It's got a really good insurance and tort liability group. So I got the chance to spend my summer there working on all sorts of files, slip and falls, car accidents, aviation files. And they were really, really interesting, just like the tort cases that you see in law school. When you article, you rotate through multiple groups, and I ended up rotating through a tax group. And I quite like tax as well. And tort didn't necessarily align with my background very well because I have a business undergrad. I did an MBA as well. So I really enjoyed working in the tax group during our articling term. So whenever you were working at a big firm, you rotate through multiple groups, and then you submit a document that would say, I'd like to work within the tax group. And that when they make decisions, then they use that document to match you with a group. I fortunately got my first choice, which was tax, and I ended up working in the tax group at BLG. Other areas might not evolve as fast as tax law, or as much as tax law. Every year you have a new budget that comes out and revises, 10 different provisions or so. Every year it's different, but of course, it makes multiple changes. And there's always changes with CRA policy, and there's always changes in the way people do certain transactions, and perhaps somebody found some sort of a tax loophole. Now, it starts with one person that finds it, and then that person's memo all of a sudden makes it somehow to another lawyer, and then the particular tax planning mechanism starts gaining momentum, and all of a sudden the whole world's using it, and then the government finds out about it and closes it down. So, so some of them get shut down, some of them don't get shut down. Somebody figured out how to structure something in a manner that's legal and that doesn't offend any provision of the Income Tax Act. And then if a client can save quite a bit of tax using it, and there's not a whole lot of risk to that transaction, it ends up being that the client implements it, and then it just grows, right? Client tells their friend at a meeting that they've done this crazy transaction. All of a sudden their friend's doing it, and the whole world ends up doing it. So, depending on how offensive the transaction is, the government may shut it down, might say this is in line with our tax policy, and it's perfectly fine to engage in tax planning in that matter. So,
did you have a favorite tax law course or professor or a particular type of tax that got you excited about working in tax?
I liked taking courses with late Professor Tim Edgar. I think the way he taught tax was quite in line with my way of thinking. I took 3 courses and all of them were with him. He had a very structured approach. Income Tax Act can be described as a very large formula. It's not as simple as just adding 2 numbers, but the general way that it's structured could be described as a large formula. And he taught it using a very straight formulaic approach, except that, the annotated Income Tax Act is 2,500 pages or so. So it's nearly impossible to know it all. Even people that have practiced it for many, many years certainly will not proclaim that they know it all. And there's various sub areas within the income tax. So we're also certain people practice mutual funds tax, right? That's a very, very small, very niche area. There's people that specialize in foreign companies that are subsidiaries of Canadian companies and the taxation that takes place there. Tax is very diverse. So that's tax planning. And there's always, of course, tax litigation. You could work in a certain niche and might not know about somebody else working in a completely different niche, right? Or your paths might not cross at all.
I wonder in big industries, because you've worked on a lot of bigger deals, you're likely not to cross paths with someone doing small tax estate planning, for instance, when you're working on a $20 billion partnership agreement with a consortium led by investment company Blackstone and Thomson Reuters Financial and Risk, for example. You also had other billion-dollar acquisitions. What is it generally like working on that kind of large-scale deal as a tax lawyer?
On a large-scale deal, you're part of an extremely large team, not just within the firm that you're working at, not even just law firms. Then you're part of, accounting firms get involved, and financial services firms could get involved, banking institutions. So there's lots of parties on a large transaction. As you can imagine, lawyers represent interests of so many different parties, right? So you could be acting for the buyer, the seller, the lender, you name it. There's so many parties that are involved. It could be 10 different parties, and there's a big law firm that represents a certain interest. And at that law firm, there could be, if it's a small interest that doesn't require a whole lot of expertise, there might be 1 or 2 people working on the transaction. But if it's a buyer or a seller, a firm that represents the buyer or the seller, then you probably have, maybe 10 people working on the matter, including a few partners from different groups, a few associates from different groups, a few students. So it's a very, very comprehensive process, and it requires a huge coordination. You have a partner that oversees, let's say, the tax aspects of the transaction, and he kind of has a general thought about how the transaction should unfold, but you help out with research and putting together memorandum and looking into various issues in order to identify whether or not the transaction should be structured one way or the other.
Do you feel that there's a little extra shiver of excitement working on a bigger deal rather than a smaller deal, or does it not matter? You're doing similar kind of work?
I mean, personally, I feel like I'm doing different kind of work, but I'm still trying to do as good of a job as I've always done, regardless of where I'm working. And some people really, really, are proud of saying I worked on this large transaction, or I did this large deal. To me, that never was the driving motivator at all. I never got any satisfaction from doing it. I got more satisfaction from feeling a sense of connectedness to whoever I was working with and feeling like I was providing value. I think that's really what motivates me to get up every morning and to speak with clients. And that hasn't really changed. So in that sense, right. I mean, life isn't really different, whether or not you're providing value to a corporate client and you're talking to them every day and you're kind of providing them with feedback, or whether you're working with a smaller, $10 million small transaction, and you're still talking to the owner every day. Perhaps they're much more vested because they have a direct interest in what it is that's being done. Yeah. And there's probably a greater sense of that connection and purpose in a smaller transaction, I guess, than it would be on a larger transaction. So that's what I found.
you must have a very different life now when you're not having a million other lawyers around you working on a big deal, because you're running your own business, Taxpayer Law. And that must be quite different from being in that Bay Street mentality and workplace. How is it different working for yourself?
Yeah. So I feel that working for yourself is definitely different. I work more, not less, which is quite surprising to a lot of people that think, you work hard at a Bay Street firm. You probably work more for yourself. I mean, I'm always working till 11 p.m. every single day. And that doesn't mean necessarily that I'm billing time to matters, but that means I'm thinking about my clients, or I'm thinking about what I need to delegate to my associate, or who do I hire next, and where do I get new clients? How do I market myself? So there's a lot more on my plate rather than less. So you still have to do the tax work. You still have to, do the documentation. You still have to do the planning. But then on top of it, you have to bring in clients. You have to make sure that the bills get paid, that everybody gets a paycheck at the end of the day, in their bank accounts. And so,
it's probably easier for a tax lawyer than other kinds of lauriers.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, maybe. I mean, there's lots of differences. I mean, I find that, financially, is there a difference? Well, I'm still billing at rates that are probably comparable to rates that are the large firm charges, and I'm not an associate, I'm an owner. So, I mean, from that perspective, you're as many, if you bring lots of clients, you'll do financially pretty well. So from that perspective, I mean, I don't know whether or not a larger firm is necessarily a better choice, because the competitive nature of the legal industry means that it's becoming harder and harder to become partner. And when I say partner, I mean equity partner. Lots of firms make income partners out of those that are top performers, but the threshold to go from income to equity is not a light one. So it's something to consider, because that's the fact is the industry is very competitive, and it's taking, it used to be that generally firms provided that there is 6 years before you would be considered for partnership. Now it's generally 8 years, and partnership doesn't necessarily mean equity partnership. It could mean income partner. And then, how long are you going to be an income partner for? Is it another 8 years? Possible. And then all of a sudden, you're in your perhaps 15 years into your practice, and you're just starting to get a small equity share of the income. And the way it works is that you start, generally you start at the very bottom, and you make a small piece of the pie, and then hopefully after you work for many, many years, then you'll make a greater piece of the pie. But again, the structure is just financially might not be as rewarding as people think, because of that competitive nature of the industry and the desire of the people at the top to try to maximize their income. But I mean, it always depends on the person and whether or not they could fit within one type of practice or not. And financial rewards are not everything in this world. I find that another difference between my firm and larger firm is that I don't have committees. I don't need any approval from anybody. I find if I want a certain software tool, I can just go and buy it, and I can have it the next day. And I think that's great. I use the latest and greatest tools in my practice to provide the best possible value to my clients. And those software companies aren't going to charge you $100,000 that they otherwise might, because they know you don't have the resources. I guess that's another difference. You don't have that much in terms of resources, right, when you're starting off on yourself. Whereas at large firms, there's much more in terms of resources, in terms of training resources.
As a lot of the people watching this will be law students, what advice would you have for students who are looking to enter the practice of law, and what can they expect in the upcoming years?
Yeah, so I think any law student has to think about where they will be in 30 years and how will the industry look in the 30 years. Because a lot of the times people look at large law firms and they say, I want to go there because A, the work might be challenging, or B, because the pay is so great. Well, will those large firms still be the dominant force of the legal industry 30 years from now? Well, if I were to ask you how many of the 20 largest companies in the world today by market value would be the 20 largest companies 20 years from now, then you might say a few. Well, a good predictor of that would be how many of the 20 largest companies 30 years ago are here today, and the answer is none. And I think every law student needs to ask themselves, what will the legal industry look like in 30 years? And is the big firm structure the kind of structure that will be in place 30 years from now? I'm a believer that the world will look very different. So that's why I think that I wanted to do my own practice and I want to implement innovative tools. Although large firms, as I said, they do have the resources, they have great training. If somebody doesn't know what they want to do, they have an ability for you to rotate through various practice groups and to explore various areas of law. Law students have always said, the biggest and best and most prestigious firm is where I should be going. Might not be the best and most prestigious firm 30 years from now. And I think a good symptom of that is that law firms have a huge shortage of associates. I think right now, on my LinkedIn feed, I see all these recruiters saying, go to New York, go to London, go to Australia. There's all these firms hiring associates because there's lots of people that are understanding that the law is not going to be the same. So why would I pursue something that could be a legacy structure? But when I am at the top of the food chain in 30 years, will there be associates working for me and feeding that food chain?
It's a great question, and I appreciate your time and your honesty. And I'm sure you'll have a lot of summer students applying to work with you.
Thank you very much. I hope so. I'm looking forward to recruiting from University of Ottawa, and I'm looking forward to meeting a lot of people.
Thanks for listening to the Tax Law Society podcast from the University of Ottawa. Today's show was produced and edited by me, Amie Watson, with research and graphic support from Adriana Conti and Arjun Gupta, and audio engineering support from Max Desmarais of Mix by Max. The Tax Law Society is committed to helping law students find jobs and build careers in tax law. If you want to learn more, check out our website at www.taxlawottawa.ca.